Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
These are patriotic Canadians.
Oh my God!
We're now attacking different older people.
You guys are disgusting!
Look at this fucking news media. Look. Look. You coward! You sound
We have nowhere else to go.
My phone dropped.
Practicing
Out there.
I hope it wasn't.
Anybody with us? I see you shaking your head back there. You should be watching this. Take a lesson in courage.
Man, we declared this. Call the Conservatives
Cowards!
Nazi supporters.
Our generation theory. Every generation. Law enforcement professionals, huh?
Oh, you got blown up in Afghanistan, eh? And these guys are going to arrest you and push you back when you serve for your country?
Right, you guys keep those mentions. Resign everybody else to serve them. Go for it.
I don't smoke. I'm dying. You don't know my life. You don't know my struggle. I fought for my shit. I survived the worst. This is nothing.
Tell your boss to stop it, huh?
I've been
Follow
blown
the
up.
law.
Peace and love. And if
No
you think
respect
he
for
does,
human dignity
you're wrong.
whatsoever. We're not livestock to make rich boomers. All serial killers are boomers. I almost said that.
We love you all.
All they want is to be heard.
Take a second.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I need a minute.
You are not a serf.
I did surfing once.
We wanted to
oh
do
man, I
the
hurt myself big
SURF
too.
thing.
No. You don't want to go SERF. That's
Oh,
what these
no,
guys
I-
want you to do. They want you to go SERF.
Oh,
Nuremberg 2, boys. Can't wait to see you there.
I don't want to be here.
You guys' grandchildren are going to be born
I'd
in
much rather be
debt,
home with my wife and kids.
owing a piece of their lives to the state. Everyone's going to be straight. That's a wounded veteran! Yep! That's a wounded veteran! Yep! That's a wounded warrior right there! They got a kid on his fucking head! Back up! Back up! Back up! Back up!
Hold on, stop pushing.
Back up!
They kicked him in the leg.
Back up! Back up!
Hold on, stop pushing.
They kicked him in the leg. The RCR guy. They booted him. That was weird. Here's the one. The one who booted him was this one. Kucher Lazon. He kicked the vet that had the wounded right leg. He kicked him right in the leg.
Oh, he's a greasy one.
This guy right here. Kucher Lazon. He kicked him.
Hey, what's up, guys?
Saw you kicking that wounded veteran while he was down there earlier. You guys are a bunch of thugs, huh?
Didn't want freedom would stop everybody from having
No, not at all. You want to keep the rich guys in power right now, huh? Soaking up all the wealth, buying up all those residential properties, turning the millennials into a bunch of permanent renters, reaching into the pockets of the unborn, resigning all future children to be born into serfdom. That's you guys abusing your citizens, huh?
I am the media now.
Just following orders, just like those guards at the ovens of Auschwitz. That's you,
Those connections are getting up for all of our friends here.
right? You just do as you're told, right?
These guys are getting in. Hey, what's up, troops? It's Jeff Evely here, Ops Sgt-Maj for Veterans for Freedom. I'm back with you now. I am once again waiting for Mark Friesen to join my live stream. I swear he said he was coming. So anyway, I'm going to get things started without him, I guess, since we are doing this live. I just shot him a message, but he didn't get back to me. But on the other hand, he did say that he had court today. So I hope everything went well. That's all I can say. Yeah, we touched base earlier today there, and everything looked like it was a go. So hopefully everything's all right there. Okay, so I'm going to show a couple of videos here to get an intro into Mark. Some of this I showed the last time he was up, and some of it I didn't. I'm really hoping we get him in here to comment this time. But regardless, let's go ahead and power through this sucker. I'm just going to put up my screen for you so you can see it. Okay, so this is Mark Friesen's TikTok here, and this is the question that he had for Pierre Poilievre. This is a pretty good little clip here.
How you doing? What's your name? Mark, thanks for coming. And we'll do a shot here.
I have one question.
Oh,
I have for you.
yeah.
I'd love for you to answer.
Fire away.
You denounced the World Economic
Yes.
Forum vehemently.
Yes.
You denounced the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDGs.
I haven't read it, so I don't know what it is.
You haven't read it?
No, I haven't.
That's interesting.
Do you want to do a shot?
Sure.
All right.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. I'll have to look at it.
Yes, you will.
I don't.
It's very important.
I have a simple rule. If I haven't read it, I don't comment on it.
You need to read it. It's extremely
Thank you
important.
for the good recommendation.
Absolutely.
I'll have a look at it.
Very good.
Okay. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks.
How you doing? What's your name?
Okay, so yeah, before I go on, I should mention that Mark is he was a PPC candidate in the last election, and he also ran for the Buffalo Party there in Saskatchewan. I'm not very familiar with it. Looks like it's kind of a right-leaning, conservative-leaning party. But Mark is pretty big on this SDG stuff. So that's the Sustainable Development Goals there, the UN Sustainable Development Goals that seem to be out to crush oil and gas, and and it's one of these international kind of treaties that we signed onto now. So it looks like we're kind of hooked, but let's just see. Mark's going to kind of explain it here for us.
All right, quick 2-minute drill on my little.
So this is his YouTube channel here, and Mark's pretty good for these 2-minute drills. He likes to throw those up on his TikTok, and I think he's on Twitter too. But anyway, he does these 2-minute drills. They're pretty good. He just does like a 2-minute video at a time, and it's very plain speak, and I think it resonates. It's pretty effective messaging.
Little soiree with Pierre Poilievre last night. I guess I have to interpret that a little bit for some people. I'm amazed at how many excuses are being poured all over Twitter on behalf of Pierre Poilievre. Listen, the guy has been a politician for 19 years. He was a senior cabinet member in the Harper government. The Harper government is the government that signed the latest incarnation of the Sustainable Development Agenda in 2015. The fact that Pierre Poilievre answered my question by suggesting that he has no idea what it is and he hasn't read it is an outright lie. And I also find it interesting how people get pissy with me because I'm holding a politician, an elected politician of 19 years, accountable. I want them to tell us what their plan is. I want them to tell us what their intentions are. I want them to be honest. Pierre Poilievre lied to me, to my face, while it was being videotaped. He outright lied. You can't tell me this man doesn't know what the SDGs are. Of course he knows what they are. They've been around since the late 60s. Mulrooney signed it in 92. He knows this. He's lying. He's lying because he can't denounce them because his party is responsible for them. His party brought them to Canada. 92, made it law in 2008, signed it again in 2015. They're responsible for that agenda. So he can't say, yes, I denounce that, because if he did, he'd be now denouncing his party. And he can't do that. So it is what it is, folks. Shoot the messenger all you want. But I exposed him for what he is and what the party is. And you don't like it. That's too bad.
So what I think Mark seems to understand here he's got another video here, and this is kind of something that I've been talking about with a lot of my fourth turning stuff and Strauss-Howe generational theory. The politicians, I'm not going to say that they're inconsequential, although Trudeau is pretty clearly inconsequential. The man's never had an original thought in his head, and he's not a man anyway. But the thing is that we're living through an era of corruption where the politicians are essentially installed, and they're owned by somebody. And, this is just kind of food for thought. I know, like, Veterans for Freedom doesn't take a political position on this stuff. We're just kind of putting stuff out there for food for thought. And I'm pretty transparent about my own political views. Obviously, I'm a right winger, and I hope to be a PPC candidate sometime in the future. So, you take it for what it's worth, right? I mean, this is, I can only present things from my perspective, really. So it's the same for everybody. I'm just letting you know where, my unconscious biases lie. So yeah, I'm always talking about how they all kind of serve the same hegemony. So it's not really going to matter so much, I think, if we just flip from one conventional party to another. And this is just me talking. It's just kind of what I think, but they're all towing the same line. And I would offer evidence for that, probably being the two unanimous votes that we saw in the parliament during COVID. The first one was to declare the Proud Boys to be a terrorist organization, which they're not. They're a fraternity. And that was done using January 6th as the impetus. And if you're paying attention, then you'll know that January 6th was not an insurrection. Nobody declared it to be an insurrection. Nobody was charged with insurrection. They basically staged a riot using Ray Epps, who appears to be some kind of federale, an asset of some kind, probably contractor at arm's distance. Search up Ray Epps on Brave or your browser of preference. Even Tucker Carlson did a segment on that. So it's pretty mainstream now that there was some kind of what appears to be a provocateur, a hired provocateur, Ray Epps. He's a boomer, and it was a false flag, right? Like, they ginned up one side of the building there, the crowd. They got them going, and they got them to bust through the barricades. And on the other side of the building, the Capitol Police were holding the doors open for people and letting them in, only to later arrest them on trespassing charges. And then they were interned for a year, and still are, under what I understand is to be some pretty horrendous conditions as well, because it's in DC. So they're really taking out all of their, that leftist political aggression on anybody who thinks differently than they do. Not unlike what we saw in Ottawa, where the goons went out and just beat up people who disagree with them, and left them on the outskirts of town. But anyway, I digress. The point is here, I was hoping to get to talk to Mark about this, because he seems to be kind of saying a lot of the same things I am. I don't know if he's kind of tracking all the same, like the Strauss-Howe generational theory. I don't think so. That kind of thing. But that's what I'm always saying is, Justin Trudeau is just the Wizard of Oz. The man behind the curtain is the boomer. And that's just a matter of demography and natural attrition. Every generation effectively takes a turn with peak institutional power, and we're living through the period right now that the boomers are at peak institutional power. So they're the ones, the kind of puppet masters who are grooming their politicians of their choice. And it is worth noting that Pierre Poilievre doesn't actually live in his home riding. He came in from Saskatchewan. So he's kind of a ringer, they brought him into a shoe-in riding for in Ottawa Carleton there. That was a place where they knew they could get a conservative elected, and he was the guy that they brought in, and so somebody owns him, right? That's kind of what I'm saying, and I think it's what Mark's saying too. So here he is again.
All right, here's another quick 2-minute drill. Haven't done one of these since the election, but I should start doing them again. Anyways, 2-minute drill on Pierre Poilievre.
Sorry, the second unanimous vote that they had in the Commons during COVID was to put any parent who takes their systematically sexually confused child to see a qualified therapist in jail, as opposed to an endocrinologist. So you got to go to the endocrinologist first, guys. You're not allowed to seek talk therapy for your gender dysphoric child in Canada. They got to go right on the pharmaceuticals, or you go to jail. So I mean, who's really pulling the strings around here? Who does that serve? I mean, that serves Big Pharma, right? And they all voted for it, 100%. So I mean, I know what I think. Draw your own conclusions.
Listen, I know he's smooth, he's articulate, which makes him very dangerous because people like to hear him talk. They like to see him in Parliament giving Trudeau shit. He does it well. Don't fall for the con. Yes. The con. The CPC. Pierre Poilievre is running for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. Pierre Poilievre
he is the leader now. I realize this is dated, but I'm following the theme. So
very lightly denounced the World Economic Forum, fair enough, but he has never denounced Agenda 2030, Agenda 21, Sustainable Development Agenda or goals. He's never done that. He can't do it because his party is responsible for it being in place in Canada. It was Mulroney and the Conservatives, and I've said this I don't know how many times, but I'm going to do it again. Mulroney brought it in 92, and Harper made it law in 2008, and Harper signed it again in 2015. In 2019, the UN and World Economic Forum partnered to achieve the goals of sustainable development. That's what the Great Reset is. It's just a marketing ploy. That's all it is. There's no difference between the two. Pierre Poilievre can denounce the World Economic Forum until he's blue in the face. Until he denounces the Sustainable Development Agenda that his party is responsible for, then none of it means a damn thing. Please understand that. He's as globalist as the rest of them because his party will allow him not to be.
Okay. So that's Mark's take on it. I'm just putting this out here, guys. I know we do have some folks that probably like Pierre. I understand that completely. And I tell you what, he's a hell of a lot better than Trudeau. No doubt about that. But that's a pretty low bar, right? I think we need to be cynical whenever it comes to anybody who's seeking power, especially at a time like this. So now is not the time for silence, right? We might as well raise some of these concerns. And okay, I got a comment here. Esther says, I agree. Something about Pierre just doesn't ring true. Yeah, I mean, he's kind of playing a character, I figure. He kind of strikes me as the guy who was in the debate club in high school and stuck with all that stuff all throughout college, and he's never really done anything else. So I don't know. Is he a wise man? I have my doubts. Mark is talking a lot about the SDGs, and he's talking a lot about the WEF. And I've talked a little bit about the WEF before. I think he's probably a little bit more spun up on it than I am. I kind of know what I need to know. There are a lot more details I could dive into, but I don't think it changes the bottom line. That is the WEF. Like they say, they're penetrating the cabinets and they're buying influence essentially all over the world. And that's not good for us. That's not good for our national sovereignty. And nobody elected this guy. So, how are we supposed to hold him accountable for the kind of, whatever ruinous decisions he hopes to inflict on us? I wanted to talk a little bit about that. The thing is, the WEF, I don't, and this is just kind of my suspicion, so take it for what it's worth. But when I'm looking at the WEF, and this is their website here. This is worldeconomicforum.org. This is the article on Sri Lanka. I showed this in a previous podcast kind of briefly when Sri Lanka was imploding. And what I find interesting about this is, it's spin, right? I've been following Sri Lanka for a few years as a proxy for China, and in particular with respect to the ports that they were building there and the kinds of loans that they were giving them. I kind of got hip to it in a book by the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, in the U.S., and it was called Trump versus China. And he was talking about how China was using this kind of debt diplomacy to essentially enslave other nations. They get them on the hook, and they get them in so deep that they're just never going to be able to make their way out of it. And then what they do is they put them on these for their infrastructure projects. And this is all through the Belt and Road Initiative. If you guys aren't familiar with Belt and Road Initiative, you should definitely check that out because it's massive. We're not talking like just Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is right off the coast of India, right? And China is a rival to India. But they're running Belt and Road all through Africa, and it has everything to do with, I think, the kind of stuff that we're seeing right now with BRICS, with China, I think, trying to reestablish the world order as China-centric, essentially. So BRICS is that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and who just signed on to it? South Africa. They were the last one to sign on, and so that's troubling. The thing is that if they have that level of economic cooperation and also, let's say, the ability to establish their own currency effectively, then that's going to rival the U.S. The U.S. petrodollar, and it does kind of all depend on the petrodollars. And that's why I think Trump tended to try to get Russia back to the table rather than alienate them, because I think he was kind of reading the tea leaves and saying, what you don't want to do is drive them into the arms of China, their next door neighbor, because that could be real trouble for the West. And we're starting to see that bear out now. So here we have this article from the actual WEF here, and I'm just kind of scrolling down. I'm gonna skip over all this stuff here. This is just kind of whatever fluff. But here the subtitle is, "Why are some people blaming China?" It says, "Many believe Sri Lanka's economic relations with China are a main driver behind the crisis. The United States has called this phenomenon debt trap diplomacy. This is where a creditor country or institution extends debt to a borrowing nation to increase the lender's political leverage. If the borrower extends itself and cannot pay the money back, they are at the creditor's mercy. However, loans from China accounted for only about 10% of Sri Lanka's total foreign debt in 2020. The largest portion, about 30%, can be attributed to the international sovereign bank bonds. Japan actually accounts for a higher proportion of their foreign debt at 11%. Defaults over China's infrastructure-related loans to Sri Lanka, especially to the financing of Hambantota Port. That's the port I was just talking about. It's a massive infrastructure project that the Chinese did, and now they have them on the hook for a 99-year lease. They gotta. It's theirs. They own it for 99 years. Okay, so default over China's infrastructure-related loans to Sri Lanka, especially the financing of the Hambantota Port, are being cited as factors contributing to the crisis. And that was very much what Newt Gingrich said in his book. But these factors don't add up. The construction of the Hambantota Port was financed by the Chinese Exim Bank, and the port was running losses, so Sri Lanka leased out the port for 99 years to the Chinese Merchants Group, which paid Sri Lanka US $1.12 billion. So the Hambantota port fiasco did not lead to a balance of payments crisis where more money or exports are going out than coming in. It actually bolstered Sri Lanka's foreign exchange reserves by 1.12 billion US. So I think it should be pretty clear, I think, to anybody reading this, that we're looking at shell corporations here, right? Like these are all proxies for the Chinese Communist Party, this Chinese Exim Bank, and so it's all like they really expect us to swallow this too. I think that's kind of a peculiar trait about authoritarians, is that they're kind of ridiculous because the number one rule in any authoritarian system is never outshine the master. So people tend to underperform and patronize their leaders, and as a result, their leaders tend to be pretty naive with respect to how much they can get away with. Especially for people like us, that they can't just snatch up and throw into a prison for the rest of our lives because we're on the other side of the world. So yeah, this is a puff piece for China. China is doing this Belt and Road thing where they do these infrastructure projects on these massive loans that can't be paid, and then they come in and they scoop it all up on these leases, or this lease, 99 years. I'm not sure that this is the only country they've done it in either, and that is the longest amount of time that you can have this kind of a lease under international law. And Newt Gingrich kind of alludes to the idea that China is following a colonialization model, or a colonization model, basically trying to mimic the success of the West over the last couple of centuries, because essentially China has been the world's dominant superpower for about 18 or out of the last 20 centuries. So they're really butthurt over being displaced from the world's dominant superpower position, and their propaganda is all about kind of punishing the West. And Xi Jinping says that he wants to punish white people and stuff like this. And so I think, or Newt Gingrich puts forth the idea that this lease is supposed to be something analogous to what the British did in Hong Kong. Now, that was a treaty, and there was a war over that. The Opium War is what they're calling it in academia these days, but it wasn't really about opium. It was about the Chinese treating the Brits like a subordinate power when they were engaged in good faith commerce in their area in China. And anyway, there was a local magistrate that treated them all like peasants, and the people in Beijing wouldn't hear from the Queen. So they drove right up the river to Beijing and made them sign a treaty that said that they were going to release all their people and all their goods. And something like 200 tons of opium were part of the goods, but that was perfectly legal everywhere in the world until 1940s America. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'll bring in Mark Friesen. Hey, Mark, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good.
Sorry I'm late. I just got off the door.
I've been doing these live streams for, just a few months really, but I'm getting used to it now. I'm getting the hang of just kind of powering through the bloopers. So no big deal. But I gave you a bit of an introduction, but I don't want to speak for you or anything. Why don't you go ahead and let anybody know here who maybe hasn't seen you before, who you are and what you're all about?
That could be a while. I've been at this this globalism game for essentially since 9/11. 9/11 was the event that sort of woke me up, and really I was concerned. I had 3 young children at the time, 6, 4, and 2, and I was a little bit concerned about the world that I was bringing them up in, and I needed to understand the world, and I wasn't understanding it at that time. So I started to dive in and try to understand what's really happening. And it took me down a lot of dark paths, but most of the paths converged on the UN, and the UN being sort of, and their agenda being sort of the pinnacle of and the root of all of the problems that we're experiencing, especially in Canada, but throughout the Western world. So I've been on this journey for a long time, and it's now started. People are starting to wake up. They're starting to see and make the connections between all of the things that are wrong in their life and that they can see is affecting them negatively, and they're starting to be able to relate it to the bigger picture, which is, of course, the UN Agenda 2030.
Hard not to these days.
SDGs, yeah. I mean, you know, and a lot of people I find are no different than I am, and they want to understand the world that they're in. And so I've been on a mission for the last number of years to help make those connections for people and to identify, what's going on and what's creating all of these issues.
Right. And okay, if you could bottom line it for us, what would you say is kind of the root cause? What's going on right now?
Well, again, it is the UN Agenda 2030. There's no question about it. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Since Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister, I mean, our successive governments have bought into this, have committed to this since 1992. But in 2015, it was Stephen Harper that signed on to it September 27th, a month before the election of Justin Trudeau. And since Trudeau's election, where 4 days after he referred to us as the first post-national state and a country that has no core identity, ever since that point, ever since him being elected, everything he has brought in, from bills to OICs to bureaucratic policy, is in commitment to that agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals of sustainable development. Everything he's done has been in line with that agenda. And so, here we are, and our economy is obviously suffering for it. We've never had more debt. We've never had worse deficits. Industry is in the toilet across the country. And there's no reason, we know exactly what the reason is, and it is the Sustainable Development Agenda.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I got a few more takes on this that I don't know. I thought maybe you and I could talk about it, because it seems, I was just saying to my audience here that it seems like we're kind of tracking a few of the same things we just went through. I'll show you here. I'll bring you up to speed on how much has been said so far. I just showed them your little meeting with Pierre Poilievre there on your TikTok. I thought that was pretty good, putting the gunny on the spot. So this is where Mark asks him about the SDGs, and Pierre says that he's never heard of them, or at least that he hasn't read them. Actually, so we showed, this one here, where Mark explains that there's just no way that he believes that Pierre doesn't know about the SDGs, and basically gives us the rundown that he just gave us, the history of everybody who's signed on to these things in Canada. And then we talked about Pierre Poilievre and what he represents, and I think essentially it's in line with a lot of stuff that I've been saying about the politicians right now. We're living through this era of corruption where the politicians are effectively installed. They serve a kind of a hegemony, and they all toe the same line. I've been saying that Justin Trudeau is essentially the Wizard of Oz, and the man behind the curtain is the boomer, because according to Strauss-Howe generational theory, the boomers are the generation that's at peak institutional power right now. And they predicted that this crisis would be hitting us in the year 2020, plus or minus 2 years back in 1990. So it's the best damn explanation that I seem to be able to find. And if you just kind of look around and pay attention, I think you'll kind of see what I mean. Who's whispering in the ear of Trudeau? Well, it is in fact the PCO. It is in fact his advisors in the public service, and it is the top bureaucrats. It's the people that are running the institutions. We saw that throughout the course of the inquiry, especially with the testimony of Jody Thomas and that other awful woman that I can't remember her name, but she's the chief of the Privy Council office there. So yeah, it was the decision making didn't really take place, I don't think, in Trudeau's brain. It's really just the signature that's required to move that forward.
And I mean, at the end of the day, I would suggest that we are literally being governed because of our own governments and successive governments' commitment to this UN agenda.
Mm-hmm.
We are essentially governed by an unelected, unaccountable foreign entity.
Mm-hmm.
And they're creating cookie cutter policy, offshore for the globe. And people really need to wrap their head around that, the policies that are in no way in the best interests of Canadians, our economy, our prosperity, our truth, our justice, our sovereignty, our freedoms. And so all of those things are negatively impacted by being governed essentially by like you said, an unelected, unaccountable foreign entity.
Well, I think that would make us ruled as opposed to governed.
Right. Yeah. 100%. Absolutely.
I've been tracking the UN thing for a while too. And I was a pretty big 9/11 truther back in the day. But I moved away from it. I don't really believe that it was a false flag or an inside job anymore. But, that could be a topic for another podcast. I know a lot of people there are a lot of 9/11 truthers out there. And, I got all the time in the world to talk about this stuff with these people. Because
right.
I understand where it comes from. I mean, we're being lied to, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Everything's
and I, I make mistakes. Everybody does. And maybe I'm wrong now, but, that's the kind of thing that you flesh out through these conversations. I want to show you something here because you mentioned the UN and how you really kind of nailed down that 9/11 stuff to them. You tracked a lot of the corruption that we were seeing back to them back then. And I've been following this for a while too. So this is back from 2010. This was a UN resolution on the defamation of religion at the United Nations. And this was dubbed the blasphemy resolution. I think Christopher Hitchens wrote a good column in Slate back in the day when this first came out. But we signed on to stuff like this. And let's see. It says several non-binding resolutions were voted on and accepted by the UN condemning defamation of religion. The motion sponsored on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Conference, now known as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, sought to prohibit expression that would, quote, fuel discrimination, extremism, and misperception, leading to polarization and fragmentation with dangerous, unintended, and unforeseen consequences. Religious groups, human rights activists, free speech activists, and several countries in the West condemned the resolutions, arguing they amounted to an international blasphemy law. Critics of the resolution, including human rights groups, argued that they were used to politically strengthen domestic anti-blasphemy religious defamation laws, which are used to imprison journalists, students, and other peaceful political dissidents. So I kind of started really sniffing around the UN back then. It wasn't right after this that we started to see things take shape in Canada, but we did have the what did we call it here? The Islamophobia motion, right? M101?
M103.
Yeah. M103. So we're passing these kinds of blasphemy laws already, I think, or we're starting to see these things really kind of make their way into our own federal legislation. But it's a creep, This one goes back to 2010. We're still at a motion right now, but you got to wonder where it's all going, eh, Mark?
100%. But, to understand why all of this is happening, I mean, we hear a lot of Western leaders talking about the importance of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
But when they're saying that, they're actually talking about it from the perspective of the United Nations. And when you look at the United Nations and all of the different groups that make up the United Nations, there's one in particular that has most of the power, and that's a group called the NAM, Non-Aligned Movement. And that's 135 nation states that have partnered and have influenced the development of the overall sustainable development agenda that we've committed to as a country. Now, do you think those 135 nation states that are made up of a lot of dictators, despots, and communists are going to have the best interest of Western civilization at heart? In fact, the opposite is true.
No, I think they see us as suckers for allowing
Yes.
them to vote at all. And they form those kinds of coalitions like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Yep.
And they vote as a bloc is
100%.
is what ended up happening. That's why you have over 100 resolutions condemning Israel and 0 condemning, say, for example, Saudi Arabia, right? So not only are we ruled as opposed to government, but look at who are governed. But look at who's doing the ruling. It's
right.
It's the world's dictators.
But yet, all of these Western leaders like Trudeau and Macron and others call that democracy, right? Where I mean, it's the opposite of democracy if you consider who's actually, making these decisions and developing these policies.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's not like democracy is about, say, for example, no taxation without representation. The Americans fought a revolution over that. So we didn't elect any of these people, and none of them are accountable to us. No. So that's sort of antithetical to democracy in that sense.
And yet our whole establishment, liberals, conservatives, Bloc, NDP, you name it, Greens, they're all committed to this agenda.
Yeah.
At the cost of literally Western civilization, the best civilization humanity has ever known. And
1,000%.
And they're all responsible for it. All of them, and we have to hold them responsible and accountable. And this is what I'm trying to get people to that point where, we can start holding these people accountable for the decisions they've made. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know how many times I've been called and referred to as a conspiracy theorist because I talk about this agenda. I only talk about what they openly advertise about this agenda.
Right.
It is, in fact, because of how it's been delivered, it's always been referred to as a conspiracy theory, while at the same time, all of our politicians have committed to it behind the scenes without reporting or telling the people. Like there isn't, when in 92, when Mulroney signed the first incarnation of this agenda in Rio, he didn't then come back home and send all of his MPs out to have town hall meetings to inform all the people of what they've committed us to. Right. No, in fact, they did the opposite. They hid it. They kept it from the people. They've never told anybody about this. Not one elected official, federally, provincially, or municipally, has ever told their constituents what they've committed to and what the consequences of this are. So that, to me, is a conspiracy. There's no theory attached to it at all. It's conspiracy fact, and it's a hard thing because the media is very good at what they do. The politicians are very good at what they do, and they've labeled this as conspiracy theory. And so anybody that talks about it is a conspiracy theorist and labeled, shamed, ridiculed, and tucked away in a corner. And this is why Pierre Poilievre, when I asked him that question, refused to answer, because he can't, because he knows he voted for it 4 times. He knows his party is responsible for it. So he can't talk about it. He can't acknowledge it or recognize it. And I mean, they've implemented it through the times that they were elected and were in government. And they've supported the Liberals in doing it since 92. So, it is what it is.
Yeah, and like I pointed out, it appears that it's not just that. I mean, I use the M101 there, or M103 of
Yep.
the blasphemy resolution seems to be getting its tentacles into our parliament as well. And there's this one other issue I wanted to kind of call your attention to here. I got this video queued up, but we got the man himself here, so I don't think it's necessary. But this is on the gun grab, C-21. So you want to go ahead and give us your thoughts on that there, Mark?
Yeah, 100%. Let me just yell at my dog for again here. Hang on.
Go for it. So for those of you who don't know, C-21 is, well, it's in committee right now. And we have a few different gun advocacy groups that are testifying. And just from some of the testimony I saw, it seems like they've really inverted the paradigm, and the onus is on the Canadian citizenry to prove that we're not murderous psychos, and not on the government to prove that these restrictions are reasonable and necessary, meet the Oakes test under the Constitution, blah blah blah, that kind of thing.
Well, you know, at the end of the day, everybody knows, or at least, you know, anybody that owns a firearm knows that this has nothing to do with the safety of the Canadian people. It has zero to do with it. None of the data fits with anything that Trudeau says in regards to this latest gun grab. This is Trudeau again committing to an unelected foreign entity that has put together a treaty, a disarmament treaty, UN small arms treaty, where they want to go after the weapons throughout the Western world, especially in Canada and the US, because that's most of the guns are, because they understand, and Klaus Schwab has said this himself, that the world is going to get much angrier as they move forward in achieving goals of sustainable development. And so they recognize that, they know that, and they understand that in order for them to come full circle in their tyranny, they're going to have to get rid of our guns.
Yeah, exactly. And we're talking about a situation where, you know, we've effectively been bankrupted, and the state is imploding. And essentially, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, you know, 500 BC. Yeah, the art of war is to it's to weaken your enemy to the point that you don't have to fight them. Okay,
Yeah.
You implode the state from within, and then you get to be the savior.
Yes.
So yeah, if China's coming in trying to be the savior around here, and there's no state left to protect us, well, the only thing stopping them is us, and so they can't have us owning firearms, right? But I have the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs up here, and here we have Securing Our Common Future. It's an agenda for disarmament. So I like to bring the receipts around here. If you guys want to go check that out sometime, there it is right there. It's right on the United Nations website, and they have an agenda for global disarmament. And I'm always trying to like kind of tie all this stuff together. I have the list here. This is everything, not everything, but this is a list of what's coming up on C-21, what they're going to ban next. And as you can see, they have things like a Ruger PC carbine, which is just a target rifle, and the SKS. I think there's over 1 million in Canada.
Right.
Yeah, and some of them work. So this is kind of an ancient Chinese firearm from the last generation of firearms. It's not even being manufactured anymore. It's all surplus. So they kind of look cool, but nobody's winning wars with them.
I used to have a Russian model, but I lost it on a canoe trip. Funny enough.
Oh yeah, yeah. Let me see here. 1 second. I gotta back this up. Okay, that's you. And so there's the UN disarmament agenda. We're kind of seeing that take shape here as well. And let me just back this out for a second. I wanted to go back to this for a second because I kind of started you out with this here, but we chased down some other threads. But this is the World Economic Forum's website, and this article is why Sri Lanka is facing one of its worst economic crises. This is from 25 April 2022. Okay, so this is Sri Lanka imploded under its own debt, essentially. And there were all of those other mandates for, the reduction of the use of fertilizer, so they weren't able to produce the same crop yields and all kinds of stuff. But right down here in the middle of the page, we have the subheader of why are some people blaming China? And it says, many believe Sri Lanka's economic relations with China are the main driver behind the crisis. The United States has called this phenomenon debt trap diplomacy. This is where a creditor country or institution extends debt to a borrowing nation to increase the lender's political leverage. If the borrower extends itself and cannot pay the money back, they are at the creditor's mercy. However, loans from China accounted for only about 10% of Sri Lanka's total foreign debt in 2020. The largest portion, about 30%, can be attributed to the international sovereign bonds. Japan actually accounts for a higher proportion of foreign debt at 11%. Defaults over China's infrastructure-related loans to Sri Lanka, especially the financing of the Hambantota port, are being cited as factors contributing to the crisis. Now, the Hambantota port was a major infrastructure project through the Belt and Road Initiative. I'll continue here. And it's in Sri Lanka. It's an international port that's in Sri Lanka. But it says, but these facts don't add up. The construction of the Hambantota port was financed by the Chinese Exim Bank. The port was running losses, so Sri Lanka leased out the port for 99 years to the Chinese Merchants Group, which paid Sri Lanka $1.12 billion US. So the Hambantota port fiasco did not lead to a balance of payments crisis where more money or exports are going out than coming in. It actually bolstered Sri Lanka's foreign exchange reserves by $1.12 billion. So this is a puff piece from the World Economic Forum that's running cover for China's debt trap diplomacy. And I think it's rather interesting that, this is Xi Jinping at the World Economic Forum, and he has been the keynote speaker there. So, you kind of got to wonder who it is that's pulling the strings behind the scene. And didn't he show up in the jammies with, no, maybe he didn't wear the jammies, but there is a whole cult there with the World Economic Forum. And it is kind of my guess, I guess, that all of these international institutions are points of contact with China, and they play Go, they don't play chess. So every point of contact with them is one that they're going to exploit. What do you think, Mark?
100%. And I mean, Sri Lanka was the golden child of sustainable development 3 years ago, and now we see exactly what that's achieved for them, which is absolutely the opposite of what anyone in that country would have wanted. And that's all by design, because what you do is you create a populace then that is 100% dependent on the state to survive. And this is the conditions that they want to create throughout the West, throughout, places like Canada, United States, the UK, who should be beacons of prosperity and freedom and justice. And we're slipping. We're losing grip of what we've always stood for and what we've always been. And so the other thing too that people need to also understand and grasp is that within this overall agenda, there's the population reduction that they want. And I have a clip, a guy by the name of Dennis Meadows, who openly discusses reducing the Earth's population from 7 billion to 1 billion. And they're very open about it. And so when you line up some of the things that they've been doing as of late, like manufacturing a virus and releasing it on the world, and then manufacturing a jab that happens to be killing people in pretty big numbers, it starts to line up with what their agenda is. And again, when you look at the people who created and developed this agenda back in the late 60s, supported by Rockefeller, Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Schiffs, and a number of other big bankers that supported this at the time, it starts to fall into place. And people start to then say, okay, well, wow, that makes sense, because they were very open about it. Dennis Meadows, one of the co-founding members of the Club of Rome. He's also one of the co-authors of a book called Limits to Growth, which is really the foundation of sustainable development. And his argument again is that the earth cannot support this population increase, which is actually hogwash because it can.
It's Malthusian.
100% Malthusian. Yes,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, and so
and Malthus was wrong, and
course.
neo Malthusians were wrong, and
Right.
yeah, I mean, we keep having to go through this, but the fact of the matter is that we develop our technology that better protects us from the elements and produces higher crop yields. So,
well, and the thing is, again, it's all about fear, and they control us through fear, and that they've been using global cooling, global warming, climate change. Hang on, I got to yell at my dog.
Yeah.
and so they use this fear to achieve these goals. And I mean, at the end of the day, they consider climate change is creating warming. Well, they actually have to change that because global warming didn't work. All of the threats that they used to create the fear didn't pan out.
Mm-hmm.
New York is supposed to be an aquarium by now, and Florida is supposed to be underwater by 2010. Never happened. So they had to switch it to climate change.
Yeah.
And so this is what they use. And of course, within the climate change narrative, CO2 was brought in as the enemy. But it's an interesting thing. CO2 in 2012 was identified as the enemy that they could use to raise money to fund this agenda. And at that time, they thought that the budget for this agenda would be around 5 trillion annually. Turns out they were wrong. It's 8 trillion annually. But they're using carbon tax because everyone's got their hair on fire that somehow CO2, carbon and oxygen, is a poison and a pollution in the atmosphere, creating warming, which it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there was a study done that came out of the Lancet 2 years ago where they actually brought together a whole bunch of scientists to find out why the earth has been greening so much in the last decade and a half. And the reason is because, of course, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, and plants love CO2. It's plant food. And the more CO2 there is, the bigger the plants, the more animals there are, which means more food for a growing population. So we're all part of this cycle of life that includes CO2 as being a fundamental building block of all life on Earth. You reduce that CO2 in the atmosphere to 150 parts per million, that's when life on Earth begins to die. And then you stack that up against their whole depopulation agenda, it all makes sense. It's like, okay, we get it.
Yeah, they're Malthusian. Somebody's talking about the Georgia Guildstones there. I mean, I think it was Ted Turner that made those. I think that's who it went back to eventually.
Yeah, that's the theory. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that there is necessarily, a powerful cult behind that's masters the world right now or anything. But yeah, I think that there is that kind of attitude amongst this generation of elites that mankind is something like a plague.
Yes.
On the environment, on the earth.
Humanity's the enemy.
Yeah. And I wanted to bring this guy in here to kind of explain how it all started for a second. And you would probably.
In 1971, I helped found an environmental group in the basement of a Unitarian church in Vancouver, Canada. 15 years later, it had grown into an international powerhouse. We were making headlines every month. I was famous, and then I walked out the door. The mission, once noble, had become corrupted. Political agendas and fear-mongering trumped science and truth. Here's how it happened. When I was studying for my PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia, I joined a small activist group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. It was the height of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was raging. I became radicalized by these realities and by the emerging consciousness of the environment. The mission of the Don't Make a Wave Committee was to launch an ocean-going campaign against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska, a symbol of our opposition to nuclear war. As one of our early meetings was breaking up, someone said, "Peace." A reply came, "Why don't we make it a green peace?" And a new movement was born. Green was for the environment, and peace was for the people. We named our boat the Greenpeace, and I joined the 12-person crew for a voyage of protest. We didn't stop that H-bomb test, but it was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. We had won a major victory. In 1975, Greenpeace took a sharp turn away from our anti-nuclear efforts and set out to save the whales, sailing the high seas to confront Russian and Japanese whalers. The footage we shot, young protesters positioned between harpoons and fleeing whales, was shown on TV around the world. Public donations poured in. By the early 1980s, we were campaigning against toxic waste, air pollution, trophy hunting, and the live capture of orca whales. But I began to feel uncomfortable with the course my fellow directors were taking. I found myself the only one of 6 international directors with a formal science background. We were now tackling subjects that involved complex issues of toxicology, chemistry, and human health. You don't need a PhD in marine biology to know it's a good thing to save whales from extinction. But when you're analyzing which chemicals to ban, you need to know some science. And the first lesson of ecology is that we are all interconnected. Humans are part of nature, not separate from it. Many other species, disease agents and their carriers, for example, are our enemies, and we have the moral obligation to protect human beings from these enemies. Biodiversity is not always our friend. I had noticed something else. As we grew into an international organization with over 100 million a year coming in, a big change in attitude had occurred. The peace in Greenpeace had faded away. Only the green part seemed to matter now. Humans, to use Greenpeace language, had become the enemies of the earth. Putting an end to industrial growth and banning many useful technologies and chemicals became common themes of the movement. Science and logic no longer held sway. Sensationalism, misinformation, and fear were what we used to promote our campaigns. The final straw came when my fellow directors decided that we had to work to ban the element chlorine worldwide. They named chlorine the devil's element, as if it were evil. But this was absurd. Adding chlorine to drinking water was one of the biggest advances in the history of public health. And anyone with a basic knowledge of chemistry knew that many of our most effective pharmaceuticals had a chlorine component. Not only that, but if this anti-chlorine campaign succeeded, it wouldn't be our wealthy donors who would suffer. Wealthy individuals and countries always find a way around these follies. The ones who suffer are those in developing countries, people we're presumably trying to help. For example, Greenpeace has opposed the adoption of golden rice, a genetically modified variety of rice that contains beta-carotene. Golden rice has the potential to prevent the death of 2 million of the
Oh, that's actually in the video. Okay. Well, in spite of that, I think you get the idea. What he's saying is essentially in the 70s, the Greenpeace movement kind of took a turn, and it went from being so much about the peace, but more about the green. And I think that tracks really well with a lot of what we know about cultural Marxism. I've said before that the modern environmental movement is essentially the commie watermelon movement. Green on the outside, red on the inside. And what he's saying there is that right around the 70s, humanity started to become the enemy. And I find that tracks really well with some of the other stuff that I've been talking about, in particular Strauss-Howe generational theory, and also, are you familiar with Yuri Bezmenev?
Yes.
Yeah. So he was the Soviet defector there, KGB.
And I mean, you're talking about ideologies, and this whole agenda is really a convergence of communism and fascism, as I see it. But you're looking at these ideologies; they're responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. And so when we look at some of the things they've developed, like this idea that we need to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, and along with that, we're going to restrict the use of fertilizer, which has been nothing but a boon for humanity in our ability to feed people. If you reduce it by 30%, that's going to create enormous famine and starvation around the world. This means the death of hundreds of millions of people.
Oh yeah.
But nobody takes it to the next step. Nobody goes through the process of saying, wait a minute, if we reduce something that has given us so much ability to feed, what's that going to do to our ability to feed? It's amazing to me that people just have such a hard time grasping what this all means.
Yeah, I mean, I think it means that when they say they're going to reduce emissions, they mean through a reduction in population.
Yeah, you're the carbon they want to reduce.
Yeah, and here's Patrick Moore again talking about just that, essentially, that carbon is the stuff of life. So
Freeman Dyson told me, he said,
real
well,
quick,
just look around the world right now, it's greener. And yet then when I see that happen, like
that's a proven fact.
Yeah, well, the reforestation or the regrowth in the Amazon has been phenomenal. Then I read comments in the New York Times like, well, it's ridiculous that this should have happened in the first place. You can't be like replanting or recovering from what was an environmental disaster by putting more carbon into the atmosphere. It was as though you cannot have good news. I find it quite remarkable. I get to the point where like the voices are so loud that I'm going, okay, how do I find where there actually is truth?
Well, where there's truth is that carbon is the basis of all life on Earth. And where there's truth is that carbon dioxide is the source of that carbon for all life on Earth. And it's also true that for the last 600 million years, of which we have a reasonable record, CO2 has been declining in the global atmosphere to the point where at the peak of the last glaciation, when the oceans absorb more CO2 than they do when they're warm, it was cold, CO2 dropped to 180 parts per million.
Yeah.
And that is only 30 parts per million above the death of plants. And it is surmised because there's an ash layer associated with these peaks in cold during the glaciations.
30 parts per million above the death of plants.
Yes, and it's very clear from my paper that I've just published that if we had not intervened by putting the balance back into the carbon cycle, which was out of balance, it's a really interesting story because it's life itself that has sucked the CO2 out of the atmosphere over the millennia and put it into fossil fuels, but that's a very minor part of it. The big part of it is what's called carbonaceous rocks, limestone, chalk, and marble. And those are the remains of shells of marine calcifying organisms. And the calcium carbonate is what those shells are made out of. The carbon in the calcium carbonate is from CO2 that the oceans absorbed from the atmosphere. And that is what we're fracking for oil and gas, are those marine deposits of the shells of coccolithophores, which are minute phytoplankton that learned how to build many marine organisms. It started 500 million years ago. Many marine organisms learned how to control calcification. Biomineralization is the general term for it. Our bones, for example, are a case of biomineralization. But we did it for our skeletal structure, so we could stand up. The reason marine organisms did it was to basically build an armor plating around themselves, like clams and mussels and coral reefs and crabs. All of these are calcareous. And the calcium comes from the seawater. The carbonate comes from the air and is dissolved in the water. And so these huge deposits of shale are actually calcium carbonate. They are the shells of those plankton. The oil and gas is the organic matter of the living plankton that died and fell on the bottom of the ocean. but 100 million billion tons of carbonaceous rock represent carbon dioxide pulled out of the atmosphere. And because the Earth has cooled over the millennia, nature is no longer putting CO2 into the atmosphere to offset this. So the curves are there to look at on the internet. You can see it. CO2 has been declining to where it is getting close to the end of plant life. And another 1.8 million years, if you just take that line and draw it straight down, another 1.8 million years, life would begin to die on planet Earth for lack of CO2.
Not because of an excess.
There is no such thing as an excess of CO2 under any real world circumstance.
Well, that's
okay. That about covers it there. Now, I'll point out that there is a limit to the amount of CO2 that humans can survive in. We will eventually suffocate if it gets too high. But, you know, he's just making a point. I'm sure Patrick Moore understands that very well. But it's kind of an interesting case that he's making. I think he's saying that the Earth has actually been cooling. And correct me if I'm wrong, but ice caps have only been around for something like 33 million years.
Yeah, I mean, that's what happens when there's higher CO2 levels. There's more vegetation, there's more plant life, there's bigger trees, there's bigger leaves. And in and of itself, that cools the planet. So, and we've seen this greening over the last decade and a half. And talk to any greenhouse operator, they're going to tell you they pump in 2,500 parts per million into their greenhouses to encourage and nurture these plants and encourage growth. So CO2 is plant food. And the idea that it's poison, and then we know that all of this, you know, carbon tax, carbon pricing, this whole scam that they've brought together is only a funding mechanism. They've told us this has nothing to do with saving the planet. It has nothing to do with anything of that nonsense. It has to do with it's a funding mechanism. Plus, also it leads into this population reduction.
Right. And just to kind of put another nail in this coffin here. I mean, you know, I'm not a scientist or anything, but I got a pretty good nose for bullshit. And you know, a lot of what's being put forward these days to advance the climate change narrative is coming out of the IPCC reports. That's the International Panel on Climate Change. That's also another UN body. And what you'll see the politicians doing if you read Bjorn Lomborg is what they do. See, the way science works is it's very specific. It is as accurate as you can be. Like it is 100% true. They use confidence intervals. They'll say chances are plus or minus this and blah, blah, blah. And so what they're going to do is they're going to give you a range of possibility. And then what the politicians do is they'll take the most detrimental end of that range of possibility and say, this is what we could be facing. Yeah, we could be, but what is the probability of that?
Right, and most of it's based on modeling. Computer that they control the inputs, they control the data. And so the outputs of these computer models are in line with exactly what their agenda is.
Kind of like the COVID models.
Exactly. It's exactly the same.
Yeah. And okay, so I have this graph up on the screen that I might as well go ahead and explain here. So this is Earth's temperatures going back a little over 15,000 years here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the temperatures, of course. And this is like average Earth's temperature. So this is minus 30 Celsius, and this is minus 50 Celsius. And as you can see, right here, it says the whole story of human civilization as it is taught to us supposedly unfolds in this period. So right here around 11,600 to 12,900 80 years ago. So that's about 11,500 years ago right there. So that's everything we know about human civilization happening in this warmer period. Okay. And you can see this right here is called the Younger Dryas cooling period. So this is when, you know, we would have had ice sheets 12 miles high in North America, or whatever it was. And the thing about that is this is what Patrick Moore is talking about, right? Like, there's been so much carbon trapped in the carboniferous rock, or whatever he calls it there. What is it called? It's called biocalcification or biomineralization. Through the process of biomineralization, so much carbon has been trapped in things like shale, that there's not as much carbon in the atmosphere as there used to be. And so we've seen a trending towards the cooling over time. And this is like murderously cold here. We're getting down near minus 50 temperature ranges. And that's when we have the ice sheets. And it wasn't until those ice sheets receded that we saw civilization actually come onto the scene. Now, I have some other ideas about what was going on, leading up to that warming there. But just sticking to the science for now. Check this out. So this is just the ice sheets. So they've been around for about 33 million years, I believe it says in this article here. And the maximum was around 10,000 years ago. And as we saw in the previous diagram, it was more like 12,000. But this is an interesting book that I came across once called The Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes. Turns out it's not really a cycle, but actually just a single event about a comet that hit the Earth. It was flung off from a supernova and a nearby star that they have nailed right down to a current day brown dwarf. It would have taken a few centuries for the debris to reach the inner solar system. And what happened was a comet, like ice and snow, hit North America and formed the Hudson Bay. And from there, not just the Hudson Bay, but the Great Lakes and a whole network of lakes down in the United States, in particular the Finger Lakes, that are kind of peculiar because they're shaped like rivers, but they're lakes. And it's because of the debris that came off from that impact. And what happened was the ice sheets receded, vaporized, basically. And there was essentially a nuclear winter for about 25 years where the black mat, as it's called, came up out of the ocean. It's like a black algae that is not photosynthetic, because we're talking about like all photosynthetic life having a really hard time in the aftermath of this, with maybe Yellowstone going off and so on and so forth. But anyway, the ice sheets receded and the ocean levels went way up, and I can't help but think that whatever cities might have existed prior to that were probably somewhere in the continental shelf now, 200 feet underwater, because that's what happened. The ice receded, and we got that period of warming in which all of what we now call civilization evolved. And anyway, I got a little theory about the pyramid builders basically being coming off of Noah's Ark after the ice sheets receded there around 12,500 BC and started building pyramids. But anyway, I'm not going to get into all that stuff. I got a lot of videos I got to do, buddy. But anyway, this is just kind of an interesting idea I wanted to put you and see if you were familiar with this idea of the Earth actually gradually cooling for about the last 500 million years since life started this process of carbon mineralization.
Well, let's not forget the sun. The sun is the major player in our temperature, in our climate. That's if anyone wants to focus on. Here's the thing: is they're using the terminology climate change. I can tell you that if the minute that the climate stops changing on planet Earth is probably the time when you want to light your hair on fire, because the climate has always changed. And here's the really cool thing about humanity. Humanity's always been able to adapt to a changing climate.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to stop adapting. We're not going to stop innovating and inventing and solving problems, because that's what humans do. It's what separates us from the rest of the animals on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
We're really good at that. And
Mm-hmm.
we don't need some dictatorial entity telling everybody what they need to do and controlling all aspects of their lives because of this. It's exact opposite is what you need to do. We need freedom. We need a free market. We need people to invent and solve the problems that Mother Nature gives us. That and we're
Yeah, and you know what? I've heard the arguments put forth by smarter people than me that if you really want to advance humanity, what you got to do is feed them, because what we
Right.
need are more geniuses. And you know, how many people out there are just never going to reach their potential because they don't have enough calories in their diet?
Yeah, 100%, absolutely.
Um,
And all by design, right?
Yeah, that's right. And just to kind of, I'm going to go back to this little diagram one more time here, because over here it says present global warming, and that's right here at the very end of this graph. And as you can see, like it was much warmer just during the medieval warm period. That's right here. There was a mini cooling. They're calling this a little ice age, and it's basically coming right down to the point where we are right now. Like,
Yep.
and it is kind of a mini ice age because we do have massive polar ice caps. And that hasn't always been the case. So,
Right. And they were supposed to be gone in 2010.
Yeah, that's right. So context matters, I think, is in the context of how long the Earth has been around. I remember there was a book I read one time by Bill Bryson called what was it? A Short History of Nearly Everything. And he talked about how there have been about 12 ice ages in the last 2 million years that we know about, and how the thing about ice ages is they tend to wipe out any evidence of previous ice ages. But we do know of 2 instances of what they called snowball Earth, which is a murderous condition where even the oceans are frozen about 1 meter thick. So, yeah, things can get a lot worse, not just on the hot end. The hot end is about the greenhouse effect. They're always worried about, the runaway greenhouse effect. And it is a concern, I understand, from like, Carl Sagan's writings and stuff like that came from their studies of Venus, but we're nowhere near those levels. And we're not Venus either. Like, there's a very different kind of albedo effect at play. And, the plant life and stuff like that tends to bring things into balance, like you say.
Humanity and Mother Nature have always had this, synopsis, this synergy together, and we work really well together. We're part of this cycle of life, and it'll continue as long as we don't allow some small entity of elites to start dictating how we're going to live and how we're going to eat and how we're going to produce food and all these other things. So just let humans do what humans do and give us freedom, and we'll be fine.
Yeah, I agree. And I've pointed out previously things like, we're never going to run out of oil because supply and demand.
Right.
If we ever if we ever get to the end of the stuff, it'll get too cost prohibitive for anybody to buy it, and we'll move on to other technologies, right?
Of course, 100%. And that'll be another problem we'll have to solve when we get there.
Yeah.
And we'll figure it out.
But the fact that we're going to encounter problems in the future is not a reason to stop flourishing now.
Right, 100%.
Yeah,
absolutely.
All right, brother. So that brings me to the end of the clips I wanted to show you and everything like that.
Sure.
I just thought I'd give you one more chance to kind of put a nice, neat little bow on things here before we take off. So what's your main message now coming out of the Emergencies Act inquiry and whatnot? Where do you see things going, and how should people be directing their focus right now?
So as I talk about quite frequently in every one of my town halls, is COVID and all of the byproducts of COVID was all by design. COVID essentially, from what I can see, understanding this big picture, it was a social engineering project, a conditioning project to condition and socially engineer the masses to prepare them for what is yet to come. They have an enormous agenda that they want to achieve. The 17 goals of the agenda clearly identify all aspects of your life and how they want to control that. So all of this was, and really it worked in my favor, in people like me, and it worked in our favor because COVID really allowed people to look at the reality of things and how they're using these things and how so many things didn't make any sense, like, you know, masking and the destruction of the economy and destruction of livelihoods and destruction of childhoods and all of these things. It just didn't make sense based on a survival rate of 99.7%. It just didn't make sense. And then, you know, now we're seeing more and more people waking up because of the jab having creating such a problem with people's health and attributed to millions of deaths. So people are waking up. So the elites use COVID as a social engineering mechanism, but it's actually working, I think, against what they want to do, because so many people have woken up and have awakened to what this is. And so, you know, for me, it's all about information. We're in an information war. We have to win that war, and we are. And we're making advances. We're getting more and more people to understand what's happening. There's still a whole lot of people that got a lot to learn and understand, but we're getting there. And so for me, it's always been, my mission has always been information. People need to understand what the big picture is, what this agenda means, what it represents. And once people grasp that, and it's working, we've seen it work in Saskatchewan, where, you know, we did town halls through the height of the pandemic, when we weren't allowed to gather, but we still did it underground. We did it in farmers' shops, in horse corrals, in a slaughterhouse. But we got the message out. And the really cool thing about people throughout rural Saskatchewan and Alberta, Manitoba, is they still know how to speak. They still know how to communicate amongst themselves within their communities. And that's what we saw them doing. And so now when politicians tour around patting themselves on the back, what a wonderful job they're doing, they're getting called out in these town hall meetings by people that understand everything that's been done is attached to this agenda. Yeah. And they're getting called on it, and they always answer the same thing, just like Pierre Poilievre answered, I don't know anything about it, which is hogwash. Of course they do, but they're getting called out by the people, and I love to see that. So I know it's working. I know what's happening. It's just, there's a lot of folks, I think, these days, you know, we live in this immediate gratification society that everyone wants a silver bullet. They want a quick fix right now, and there just isn't one. We've been fat and lazy for decades. We haven't held our politicians accountable, and we need to start doing that. And until we do, they're going to continue to carry on doing what they've been doing for decades. We need to re-engage. We need to take back our responsibility and hold these people accountable.
Yeah, I think well put. And I would put it to you that, you know, Orwell said that if the revolution would ever come, that it would have to come from the proles. And I think that's what we saw in Ottawa. You know, I'll say if Elon Musk is listening, please stop trying to automate that industry. Keep that in the hands of the people. Okay, we got to keep that means of production in the hands of the people. And a lot of what you're saying, I think, resonates a lot with what Orwell said about that. Because it is the kind of rural and small town folks who are a little bit more community oriented and tend to be
100%. And
more,
it's those people, sorry, Jeff, those people that still cherish self-reliance, self-determination, independence, and community. They survive on those values. So and that's where we focused a lot of our attention. Of course, you know, we go into the cities, even in Saskatoon and Regina, the two urban centers in Saskatchewan, it's an uphill battle. But you go outside and into the community, the rural community, and man, they get it. They see the threat, they feel the threat, and they understand it. So that's where this thing is going to turn around. It's not going to be urbanites that are pulling us out of this mess. It's going to be rural folks, 100%.
Exactly. And I do think that the urban rural divide in Canada, as exacerbated as it is right now, it is kind of key to all this. And if there's any room for optimism, that Ottawa councillor there, what was her name? She got voted out anyway. She didn't win her the mayoral seat. Catherine McKenna.
McKenna.
Yeah, she was running for the mayoral seat. And anyway, she was the favorite to win, and she didn't get it. So there is hope for the people of Ottawa too.
There is.
All right.
Just hope for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree, and I do see things turning. There have been a lot of huge developments. I don't know what's going on in China right now. We'll see.
You know, it's slow, and there is going to be some pain yet to come, but it's that pain that's actually necessary in order to wake up and get to that moment of pure critical mass where we can actually then take that mass to affect change. So we're heading in the right direction. It's just not going to happen overnight.
No. And, you know, the convoy was never going to make it happen either. It was never going to happen overnight. I was saying the whole time we were there, I was like, guys, they're trying to false flag us. They're trying to false flag us. Like, they're going to crack down. And they did. But it was a watershed moment, woke up an awful lot of people.
100%.
Set a lot of things in motion, a lot of legal processes that I think that's where our attention needs to be focused now. If it's on anything but resiliency, family, you know, and just building yourself up for the fight ahead, because it's far from over.
100%. The antidote to globalism, hyper-centralization, the antidote to that is local, is community, is the people. That's the antidote. And we're going to naturally move in that direction as they continue to move in the opposite direction. Humanity has always done that and will continue to do it. It'll just happen. So
we're pretty damn adaptable. We're pretty damn adaptable.
We'll win.
And we've been through worse. So
we have.
Yeah. So anyway, things are starting to turn, and it looks like we got plenty of great people out there in the freedom movement. It's a real pleasure having you on here, Mark. Thanks for taking the time, brother.
Hey, man. I appreciate the platform. I appreciate the time. And again, I apologize for my tardiness, but
it is what it is. It's all good. Just happy to have you. But till next time, I'll say stay frosty and stay safe out there, troops.
Sounds good, man.